Hello, great to see you all. Thank you so much for being with us. My name is Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I warmly welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads virtual town hall program. I think it's program number 86 for 86 consecutive weeks of our programming. Our judge leadership team includes the former Congressman Mel Levine, David Lehrer, former LA County Supervisor Xavier Oslovsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. You saw our list of co-sponsors on the screen a moment ago, and we're grateful to you all. We are so pleased tonight to present the extraordinary Jared Diamond in conversation with our beloved Patt Morrison. Next week, we will welcome Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who was the target of a foiled kidnapping plot hatched by the far-right militia group. And she will be speaking on a topic which is very relevant to her leadership, and that is navigating extreme partisanship. It should be very interesting. And the following week, we will be joined by three foremost experts for an examination of generational change and its impact on politics in American society, with an emphasis on the youngest voters in America and efforts to suppress their votes. As we prepare to close out yet another digital year of programming, we want to thank you, our loyal audience. Thank you for being here each week. Thank you for your donations, and thank you for the wonderful notes you write to us. We really appreciate them. As a bunch of volunteers working on this program many hours every week, we really appreciate your presence, your donations, and your notes. Full unedited recordings of all of our programs can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website. Every email that either David or I send gives you a link to those past programs. It is the most common question we get: did you record the program? We've recorded all but one program, and they're all there indefinitely at the link we send to you. Now, please welcome my amazing partner, David Lehrer, with a few additional announcements. David?
Thank you, Janice. It's a pleasure to be back after missing last week. America at a Crossroads has become a wonderful Wednesday evening habit, and after nearly 2 years, it's hard to break. Tonight, we'll hear from one of the world's leading public intellectuals on a host of issues, a real treat. Next month promises to be as interesting and varied as the past few months have been. On January 5th, we'll have a serious examination of last year's insurrection at the Capitol on its first anniversary. Our panel includes the Washington Post's Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and author, Carol Leonig. She'll be joined by extremism experts from the Anti-Defamation League and the Center for Countering Digital Hate, Joanna Mendelson and Imran Ahmed. The following week, January 12th, we'll host a panel on the landmark Charlottesville decision rendered just 3 weeks ago, which has severely impacted and will likely bankrupt a host of violent right-wing extremists and their organizations. The lead counsel, Roberta Kaplan, who has joined us before, will be with us to talk about the case and using litigation as a tool to fight bigotry and hate. And it's a pleasure to once again welcome our erudite moderator, the incomparable Patt Morrison. In addition to being a renowned Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the LA Times, she's a best-selling author, an award-winning TV host, radio broadcaster, and the namesake of a hot dog at the world-famous Pink's in Hollywood. But I've made a mistake. I'm to introduce Xavier Oslovsky, who is a former supervisor, an icon in Los Angeles, and he will introduce both Pat and Jared Diamond. Zev?
Thank you, David. Thanks to Janice Kaminer-Resnick and Mel Levine and the whole team for making this program relevant after this now 1 year and 3 quarters of America at a Crossroads presentations. And thanks to our audience for your loyalty, for your intelligence, your interest in our programming, and your financial support. Tonight, we are privileged to have UCLA geography professor Jared Diamond as our featured guest. He's an historian, ornithologist, and in addition to being a geographer, he was originally trained in biochemistry and physiology. That should be intimidating enough to most of our audience, and certainly to me. Professor Diamond is best known for his many books on complex scientific issues, which are written to ensure that the average intellect can understand them. His seminal work, Guns, Germs, and Steel, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1997. It foreshadowed the global crises we are currently facing. It's noteworthy that tonight's guest has been ranked 9th among the world's top 100 public intellectuals by Prospect and Foreign Policy magazines. We are indeed honored to have Jared Diamond with us tonight to discuss crises, personal, national, and global. And to engage him in conversation is one of our regular moderators, the incomparable and my dear friend, Los Angeles Times columnist, Patt Morrison. Pat is well known to our viewers, listeners, and readers. Her stellar career chronicling Los Angeles life and beyond, and her stints as a commentator and host on public radio and television have made her a household name in Southern California. And she is a successful author in her own right. So Pat, I turn it over to you and Professor Jared Diamond.
Zev, thanks so much. And thanks to everybody who makes this program possible week in and week out to kind of keep us anchored and tethered to reality and common sense and a sense of hope. I think we're giving us some solutions and ideas for solutions. I have a long acquaintanceship with Jared Diamond. I hope that gives to me the privilege of calling him by his first name. Jared, are we good with that?
We are good with that, Pat.
It's a pleasure to see you again, as always. And thinking of his latest work, Upheaval, as well as Guns, Germs, and Steel, which really recalibrated how people regard the sweep of history and development across the globe. Thinking of the idea of crises that we confront now, it's not an accident that public and political figures use the word crisis to describe transformational moments in their lives, whether it's Richard Nixon's 6 crises or Winston Churchill describing the wilderness years in his own life. So when we talk about crises, I know we need to define it because we use the word so much, but I want to get a sense from you about this because you're talking about personal crises as well as national crises and global crises. So how much of a crisis is human failure to take action in anticipation of something? How much are circumstances thrust upon us? How much are actual emergencies like COVID, and how much has to have to do with our perceptions of what's going on around us?
I would start by defining a crisis as a situation in which either an individual person or a country is forced to acknowledge that its traditional ways of coping are not working. For example, in a marriage, it's the moment or it's the years when one partner in a marriage realizes that his or her way of conducting the marriage just hasn't worked and he or she has to figure out a new way. For a country, a national crisis is a situation where the country is forced to acknowledge that its traditional ways of operating are not working. And that can either be a sudden crisis. For example, November 30, 1939, the tiny Scandinavian country of Finland was invaded by the Soviet Union. That within 1 hour is an acute crisis. There are also slowly unfolding crises like what is happening in the United States now. So in short, a crisis is a situation where what you've been doing previously is no longer working and you got to find a new way of operating.
One of the templates you use in constructing this book is the idea that personal therapy, the therapy that we have in this century, last century, begun using for individuals to cope with crises, may have some lessons and some resonance for nations. For you, there was, as there is for all of us, a moment when we children become aware of the greater world beyond us, and it's not always a pleasant experience. And the growth of the idea of therapy began really in the middle of the 19th or the 20th century, as you're talking about an event that entered your consciousness very tragically.
My connection to personal crises is, of course, twofold. One, as a normal human being, I've been through my own share of personal crises. But in addition, my wife, Marie, is a clinical psychologist. And when Marie and I met, I think in our first year of marriage, Marie was doing a training as a clinical psychologist in a sub-branch of clinical psychology called crisis therapy. Therapy, clinical psychology, often has to do with long-lasting problems where you have the leisure to go back and reflect what happened in your childhood 30 years ago. But all of us know from personal experience that we have acute crises. Our relationship blows up, a loved one dies, we are fired, our health undergoes disasters, we encounter a financial crisis. And in a crisis, a person in a crisis has to get help quickly because there's the risk that in the worst case, if they don't get help quickly, they give up. There may even be suicide. So Marie, during that year when she was getting trained in crisis therapy, each Friday evening, she and her fellow therapists would have discussed during the day how their various patients were dealing with their problems. And as Marie talked about the predictors of outcomes of personal crises, I began to realize similar factors apply to the outcomes of national crises. So that's the connection for me between personal crises and my interest as a historian in national crises.
There are forms and protocols for individual human therapy, but how do you put a nation on the couch?
How do you put a nation on the couch? You can't, I cannot put a nation on the couch. A nation has to put itself on the couch. And what does it mean for a nation to put itself on the couch? It means that the nation has arrived at a widespread consensus that it's got to find some new ways of operating. The United States, for example, the United States has serious problems at the moment, but the United States has not arrived at a national consensus that the way we've been operating isn't working. Finland did arrive at a consensus after their war with the Soviet Union. The Finns recognized that their pre-war policy of ignoring the Soviet Union didn't work, and they had to engage constantly with the Soviet Union because they share a border with the Soviet Union. And the Finns learned that nobody was going to protect them during World War II. So the Finns reached a national consensus that they had to start engaging with the Soviet Union.
So many of your examples are throughout the 20th century. Is that because those are the ones we know best? Those are the ones that resonate with us and for whom the information is closest and most generously at hand?
It's true, Pat, that all my examples, with one exception, are examples in my lifetime. And I chose those examples partly because they'll be the ones that my listeners and my readers can relate to personally, will often have lived through. They're also they're the crises on which I have a personal perspective. My one exception has to do with Japan. I had two chapters on Japan, one, the problems of modern Japan, Japan today, but the other chapter on Japan in the 19th century, because in the 19th century, when Japan was forcibly opened up to the outside world by an American fleet, the fleet of Commodore Perry, Japan underwent massive change within 60 years. And what Japan did during the 19th century is perhaps the outstanding example in the modern world of a country plunged into a crisis and successfully resolving the crisis by adopting selective changes. In addition, I have Japanese relatives, and those are all my reasons for using Japan as my sole example of a pre-my birth, pre-Jared Diamond's birth national crisis.
And some personal experience as well with the countries that you studied. And the one that engaged me a lot was Chile, because Americans of the baby boomer generation are familiar with what happened in Chile. You spent time there as a student, and there were so many parallels to what we are seeing now at different stages in different countries of the world. When you write about Chile's democratic institutions and your friends telling you that, oh, Chile, we can govern ourselves. Well, Chile was able to govern itself until the moment that it wasn't. And so everybody looks at other countries in the world. From this country, we look at other countries in the world as a salutary or instructive example of what not to do. How did Chile go off the rails? A country that did say, look, we can govern ourselves. We are exempt from the politics and turmoil of our neighbors.
How did Chile go off the rails? Chile went off the rails in the same way that the United States now is at serious risk of going off the rails. So I lived in Chile a few years before the Pinochet coup d'etat. And when I was living in Chile, my Chilean friends were proud of Chile as a democracy, virtually unique in Latin America. Chile had been a democracy almost uninterruptedly ever since independence, a democracy seemingly as successful as the United States, a democracy operating as a democracy only 20 years less than the United States. And therefore, it was a shock to Chileans when the coup d'etat overthrew the democratic government and a military government remained in place for something like 17 years. I teach UCLA undergraduate students now. I've taught them a course in national crises, and the example of Chile is the one that upset my students the most. And I must say, now especially, Chile is the example that upsets me the most because it illustrates that what appears to be a stable democracy can fall apart within a couple of years and end up with a military government that set world records for torture and sadism.
You note some factors that made it happen: increased polarization, violence, and a breakdown of political compromise. Where have we heard that before?
What American has heard of political polarization? Well, every American who reads the newspaper, every American who walks on the streets, every American who reflects that they are capable of talking to half of Americans and that they don't want to talk to the other half of Americans. In my lifetime, Pat, I would say that the United States has experienced polarization in my lifetime. Yeah, I lived through the Vietnam War, the communist fears of the 1950s, but the polarization that we're undergoing now in the United States seems to me the worst of my lifetime.
And those factors you contrast in the book with the era of only 20, 30 years ago, when there was compromise, when in the 1980s, you had figures like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill who opposed each other's ideals, political ideals, but managed to get things done, which has always been a hallmark of our democracy, a kind of practicality.
It's disconcerting. For democracy to function, there has to be compromise. A democracy encompasses people with different points of view. And in a democracy, there are elections so that those who lose the election today may win the election in the future. Compromise is the essence of democracy. The United States, throughout its history, there have been famous non-compromises, of which the extreme example was the Civil War. But by and large, in my lifetime, the United States has done reasonably well with compromise. And for example, in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was president, the Democrats, with the House Speaker Tip O'Neill's attitude towards Ronald Reagan was that he disagreed with Ronald Reagan's politics, but Reagan was the president, and it was up to the president to set the agenda. Tip O'Neill brought Reagan's proposals to a vote quickly, even if O'Neill disagreed with him. And between Reagan and O'Neill, they managed to reach compromise on really difficult issues such as taxation and business. So, but that was in the 1980s, and that's what, 33 years ago. Why in 33 years has compromise in the United States gone downhill, and especially in the last 29 years?
Another example you bring up in the book is Germany. And Germany, which not only went off the cliff in its own way, but took the rest of the world with us very, very closely, almost took the rest of the world with it. But Germany did put itself on the couch. Germany did examine itself and rehabilitate itself almost as a patient, a human patient might. Can you walk us through those steps and what we can learn from that?
Germany is a striking example. So Germany, it's a country that I know well. I've lived there. German is my best foreign language. Some of my closest friends are Germans. I lived in Germany in 1961, and with my Jewish background, I was obviously interested in the question, why did it happen? Why the Nazi era? In the 1960s, Germany was beginning to come to grips with the legacies of the Nazi era. It was not yet far advanced in the 1960s, but nowadays, Germany has been more pitiless, more clear about coming to grips with the horrible things that it's done in the past than any other country. German school children are routinely sent to former concentration camps. For example, outside Berlin is the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen, and German school children in Berlin, they're sent to see Sachsenhausen, to see what Germans themselves did. German school children are encouraged to visit Israel, and again, to talk firsthand with the survivors of what Germany did. So Germany, more than any other country that I know, has explicitly come to grips with the horrible things that it did in the past.
And we find ourselves at a point doing just the opposite, where states and schools are trying to ban what they call critical race theory, which they seem not to be able to define very well. But if you ask them, I suppose it's anything that's critical of their race. The idea that self-scrutiny in this country, that's a bad thing. And that seems to take us out of the running from many steps in terms of self-healing, of self-correcting in a crisis.
What the word that would, I think, capture what you're saying is acknowledgement. So Germany has acknowledged pitilessly what they did. The United States, they were broad, their areas of American history where acknowledgement is, to put it mildly, deficient. Our treatment of Native Americans, our treatment of African Americans, and this breakdown of acknowledgement in the United States is particularly sad and dangerous today, where Americans are not acknowledging what they are doing to each other. Americans are not acknowledging, so many Americans are not acknowledging the views of half of the rest of the country, differing from what individual Americans believe. I have friends, yeah, I have a good friend who no longer speaks to her aunt and uncle. Why? They're nice people, but their political views differ from her political views.
And is that one of the failings that can undo us, that we are not talking across this divide, much less compromising on policy?
Pat, that is the only failing that can undo us. In the United States today, we are worried about China. We are worried about Russia. What might Russia do to the Ukraine? What might China do to Taiwan? But the fact is that there's nothing that any country in the world can do to ruin the United States except what we Americans can do and are at risk of doing to ruin the United States. The United States is protected geographically. There's no way some other country is going to invade the United States. There's no way that any other country can destroy the American democratic system of government. The only people who can destroy and are in the process of destroying the American democratic system of government are we Americans.
You write early in the book about 12 steps, not the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous or other programs, but the 12 steps that someone might do in therapy, including the acknowledgement, to come to terms and to begin to turn around. And some of those are applicable to the way nations have been able to heal. But it seems to me that one of the strengths of the United States in the past, that sense of can do, almost an invincibility, has now become a sense of arrogance and a prickliness that we're not doing anything wrong. We can't do anything wrong. We're the United States. And that seems like a barrier to accomplishing the kind of solution of a crisis that you're proposing.
That's an interesting point, Pat. The two-faced nature of America's successful history. On the one hand, the United States, Americans have a can-do attitude, and the United States has succeeded in overcoming massive problems, including the first modern civil war, which was really the first modern war at all. So the United States has had a long track record of success. On the other hand, that track record of success means that we Americans are disinclined to learn from other countries that are wrestling with and have successfully dealt with problems that are plaguing the United States today. Countries can learn from other countries. The United States is reluctant to learn from our neighbor, Canada. Canada, a neighboring democracy. Canada deals with crime and education and healthcare and immigration more successfully than does the United States. So why is it that we Americans won't look to Canada and learn from Canada? It's probably because of our attitude that the United States has been so successful that there's nothing that we can learn from any other country.
You use the term selective change. This is how people choose to cope with their crises. What is selective change as far as countries are concerned?
First of all, selective change as far as people is concerned, and then we'll come to selective change as far as people is concerned, is that all of us know from personal experience of relationship breakups and health crises. We all know that when we're in a crisis and we recognize that something about us is not working, we don't throw away everything about ourselves. Instead, we have to figure out what about ourselves is not working and has to be changed, and the rest of us is okay. because if we have the mistaken attitude, everything about us isn't working, we get paralyzed. So you have to begin by recognizing what needs changing. That's to say, selective change is the essence of dealing with personal crises, but similarly with national crises. Take the United States. The United States needs some selective change, but there are other things about the United States that we have a wonderful history and we should not change. The United States, for example, the United States is the most polyglot country that I know. In my UCLA classes, in a UCLA class of 100 students, I probably have 53 languages among my UCLA students. So the diversity within the United States is something that we hopefully will not get away from. The United States is a functional democracy. Democracies have basic advantages over a dictatorship. Democracies operate slowly, but democracies can make change, and democracies can decide that what the government is doing is bad, as happened during the Vietnam War. So the United States hopefully will retain our democratic government, but other things, such as notably our polarization now, the United States is in need of changing.
I went through some of your qualifiers for countries being able to be flexible enough to deal with crises. And I don't think it's a passing report card. National consensus that we are in crisis, honest national self-appraisal, situational specific national flexibility. I think we'd have to go to summer school for some of those and repeat the course.
It is of concern that it seems to me now that lots of Americans, maybe even the majority of Americans, are in a state of denial about our problems. But just as with personal crises, if your marriage is in difficulty, the first thing you got to do to repair your marriage is to acknowledge that your marriage is in difficulty. If you deny that your marriage is in difficulty, you get nowhere. And similarly, Pat, you mentioned the 12 steps of AA. The first steps of Alcoholics Anonymous is to recognize that you have a problem. If you don't recognize that you have a problem, you get nowhere. So the first step is acknowledgement. That's a step that's not widespread in American politics today. And the second step after acknowledgement is to accept responsibility, not to blame others, not to say my drinking problem is the problem of someone else, not to say that the problems of the United States today are all caused by Canada and Mexico and China and Russia, and they're not problems of the United States. So the second step in a national crisis, just as in a personal crisis, is to acknowledge your responsibility for doing something about it. And then the third step, Pat, is what you mentioned about selective change, to acknowledge those things about yourself or your country that are working well and that don't need changing, and then those things that do need changing.
Let's talk about global crises. And I think the one that comes first to people's mind, and I think to yours as well, is climate change. And is it a crisis of degree or of kind? And how do nations work together to try to solve it when in fact some of their investment in solving it is very different? Some are less invested than others, some are less at risk than others, and one country's gain may be another country's loss.
Climate change, Pat, is a good example to discuss, because I would deny that climate change is a national crisis. Instead, climate change is an international crisis. Is climate change a national crisis? Is there any country that could solve its problems of climate change by burning less coal itself and reducing the carbon dioxide levels over the United States? Of course not. If we burn less fossil fuels and reduce carbon dioxide production in the United States, there are the 215 other countries in the world. So climate change is an international problem. It's a global problem that requires a global solution. There's no country that can solve its climate change problem by itself.
And as for all the countries who weigh in, they have acknowledged that it's a crisis for the most part. This country has been slow in doing so and not consistent. And then does it follow naturally that solutions are going to be at hand, or is this a fight every step of the way, as it is in the 12 human steps, the personal steps you outlined?
Does it follow naturally that solutions that solutions will be adopted? No, of course not. Just as people can fail in solving a crisis, nations can fail in solving a crisis, and now the world can fail in solving solving crises. For the first time in human history, we have global problems that are acknowledged to be global problems and that require global solutions. Climate change, are we going to succeed in solving the problem of climate change? Well, because I was born in 1937, we have maybe what, 30 years to solve climate change or to fail to solve climate change. I'm not going to be around in the year 2050, but the reason my twin sons were born in 1987. In the year 2050, our twin sons will be 63 years old, and my twin sons and their generation will see whether the world succeeds in solving the problem of climate change or whether we fail, because we have about 3 decades to get our act together. If we've not mastered climate change, and if we've not adopted a sustainable economy by the year 2050, it'll be too late.
Is the COVID crisis kind of a dress rehearsal for climate change? Are there any examples or lessons from it that can be applied to climate change?
Pat, I'm smiling because I suspect either that you've read my 173 op-ed pieces that I've written over that year.
Oh, you got me.
or alternatively, Pat, you and I, great minds converge in the same solution. So the thing about COVID, COVID is a global problem, just as climate change is a global problem, just as the United States cannot solve its COVID problem, just as the United States cannot solve its climate change problem by reducing the carbon dioxide levels over the United States. Neither the United States nor any other country can solve its COVID problems by reducing the level of COVID microbes in our atmosphere, because the first person that comes across the border infected with COVID will reinfect us. And in fact, there are countries, notably Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam, try to lock down and exclude COVID. But in the modern world, that doesn't work, because jet airplanes and travel mean that any country that temporarily reduces its COVID level to 0 is just going to get reinfected. All of this means that the world is not, no country is going to be safe against COVID until the whole world is safe against COVID.
And the same goes for climate change. You can't play whack-a-mole, even though, for example, California was a leader in terms of suppressing emissions. It set an example rather than, I think, made much of a dent.
That's true, Pat. California is embedded in the United States. What California does, unless the rest of the United States, California is a relatively progressive state as regards climate change, but California alone cannot solve American problems of climate change, nor can California solve world problems of climate change. Just as an example, dust and winds blow across the Pacific Ocean. So there's dust fallout from Asia in the United States, including California. That means that California cannot solve its climate change problems unless Asia solves its climate change problems, and also vice versa.
There's a new element that's been introduced into dealing with human problems, with the planet and with the people on it. And that's this sense of, we'll go to space, we'll go to Mars as a deus ex machina, and that'll solve all of our problems. Is there any parallel to this in human history? It almost has an apocalyptic feel to it. And is there a danger that people are investing emotionally in this, much less the billionaires investing personally, and that's going to skew our viewpoint about how we solve our problems here on Earth?
I hope that it won't, because I hope that few people, that there are few other people than certain unnamed people stupid enough to believe that the solution to the problems of planet Earth are to colonize planet Mars. After all, first of all, Mars is a very inhospitable environment. If I had to name what I would like to do to my 100 worst enemies, it would be to send them to the planet Mars. But on top of that, if we have not succeeded in solving our problems here on planet Earth, what makes you think that we'll solve our problems on planet Mars? But the fact is that planet Mars is not going to be in our life. It's not going to be in the lifetime of the solar system. A planet suitable for life, for intelligent life, the way the Earth is.
I suppose one of the parallels here on Earth before all of the Mars exploration caught fire was that technology would be the solution, that all we had to do was put our, excuse me, put our problems through the combine, the machinery of technology, and it would all come out solved at the end, that it was a kumbaya moment for us.
Pat, what I see as one of the big obstacles to solving the problem of climate change is the belief that it's solvable by technology. The fact is that we could solve the problem of climate change right now without any new technology, because we humans have created the problem of climate change by burning fossil fuels excessively. All we have to do to solve climate change is to reduce our energy consumption and to shift our energy consumption from fossil fuels to sustainable sources of energy. So we don't need new technologies to solve the problem of climate change. But on top of that, there's a broader message here, Pat. Whenever I hear someone look to technology to solve an important problem, it's what being married to a psychologist, Marie, I think of as a resistance maneuver. Namely, people avoid dealing with problems in the belief, in the hope that technology will solve them. And I'll give you an example there. I'm old enough to remember this, and Pat, you are not old enough to remember this. When I was growing up in the 1940s, the last thing that my father did, and other people of his generation before going to bed at night, is to check the refrigerators to make sure that the refrigerators in our house were not leaking. Why? Because the refrigerant gases of the 1940s were poisonous. And if your refrigerator leaked, you would die in your sleep. So in the 1940s, new refrigerant gases, so-called CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, were invented, and they were not poisonous. And that technological breakthrough seemed a wonderful solution to the refrigerator problem, until it turned out, and took about 20 years to figure out, that CFCs, these new refrigerant gases, when they escape into the atmosphere, do things in the atmosphere that they don't do in the laboratory. Namely, they destroy the ozone layer. That's a model for the generality that technologies that produce good effects also tend to produce bad effects. I'll give you one more example. My tutor at college, he was old enough that he was growing up in the first decade of the 1900s, and he remembered the arrival of motor cars in American cities in the early 1900s. When motor cars arrived, people in his childhood said, motor cars are going to make American cities clean because they will replace horses. There will no longer be manure on the street, and American cities are going to become clean and quiet with motor cars. Well, motor cars, yes, replaced horses, but motor cars had other negative consequences of dirt and noise.
So the parallel with CFCs is good, because while your own refrigerator may have poisoned you in your own house, the CFCs poison everybody on the planet by enveloping the planet and doing damage to the ozone layer. So you exchange one set of damage for another, with that overlay, that sense of technology as a plus, as an advancement.
That's true, but Pat, I'm glad that we were on the subject now of CFC.
I thought you were going to say we're on the subject of horse manure.
I've said what I have to say about horse manure. But as for CFC, you and I have been discussing heavy stuff and heavy problems, and people listening to us may start to get depressed. But think of CFCs. CFCs are a major problem that the world largely solved by a global effort. There was kicking and screaming, and it took 20 years, but eventually the world reached a global agreement to ban the production of CFCs. And production of CFCs is now yes, there's a little, but it's now minimal. That's an example of the world uniting to solve a global problem by banning CFC production. So my hope will be that with that precedent and other global problems like smallpox and double hull tankers, the world has solved global problems in the last few decades. My hope is that we can solve the problem of climate change, COVID and climate change.
Do nations like the United States, I'm going to get to our audience questions after this, do nations need a sense of, apart from Germany or maybe South Africa with its reconciliation, do we need a sense that we're not guilty, it's not our fault, we'll have a solution, but we don't have to admit that we did anything wrong in the first place?
with nations as with marriages. If a marriage is in trouble, usually both people are participating, and if the partners in marriage, if each of them don't acknowledge what they did wrong in the marriage and change it, the marriage is not going to get fixed. And similarly with nations, if a nation doesn't acknowledge what it's messing up, if the United States doesn't acknowledge that it's messing up compromise, and that our healthcare system is the worst healthcare system among major democracies, et cetera, and that inequality in the United States is close to the worst in any major democracy. If the United States denies, the United States is not going to solve these problems.
Let's get to our questions from our audience. Pearl wants to know about your assessment of the nation's future given Trump in the past 5 years. And let's put into that mix some of the concerns that you have, the specific concerns about how democracy derails, which include elections, for example, and income inequality, and a failure to invest in a literal as well as figurative future for people. So if you could, in that context, talk about Pearl's question.
So in that, what about the United States? Is the United States going to solve its problems? Wait and see. That's up for grabs. It depends upon elections. It's been the last presidential election was decided by what, 0.1 or 0.5% of the vote. There was an election for governor of Washington about 8 years ago that was decided in the populous state of Washington. That election was decided by something like 378 votes, all of which means that it is up for grabs, but it's in the hands of Americans. If you don't like what the government is, if an American does not like what the government is doing, it's our fault, because turnout for elections in the United States is the worst turnout again in major democracy. Italy has never had a turnout of under 85% for a major national election since World War II. Or Indonesia, who would think of Indonesia as a major democracy? But Indonesia, when it had its first democratic election in 2000, the turnout was 93%. In contrast, the highest turnout for a presidential election in recent American history was what, 62% in the last election. And speaking of Los Angeles, I believe that Zeph can correct me on that. I believe that the average turnout for the election of mayor of the city of Los Angeles, the most powerful politician in one of the most important cities in the United States, the average turnout for mayor of Los Angeles in the election is 20%. So if you don't like our mayor, 80% of you get the blame for not liking the mayor because you didn't vote.
That sounds about right. Yes, that percentage. Randy says, as a Haitian, I'm deeply troubled by what's happened in my homeland in recent years. What's your take on that island nation?
So could you say again, what is my take on
Haiti? He's a Haitian by birth, and he says he's very troubled by what's been happening there.
Oh God. I'm troubled by Haiti too. I've not been in Haiti. I've written about Haiti compared with the Dominican Republic that shares the same island. Perhaps the most dramatic moment in any airplane flight that I've taken in my life was the flight from the United States to Santo Domingo, capital of the Dominican Republic, because the airplane flew over the national border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's the most dramatic national border in the world. On one side, the Haitian side, brown because of deforestation. On the other side, the Dominican side, green because of maintenance of forest. Haiti is the poorest country in the New World, and it has some of the most difficult problems in the New World. I wish that I could offer our Haitian questioner some solutions. I can't.
The reforestation of the Dominican Republic has been one of the remarkable success stories, I think, from something like 10% cover to something like 60% cover, which may itself be an example for other nations on how to fight against deforestation and thus protect it as the bulwark against climate change.
That's true, and I will throw in one other example. Japan, country, my Japanese relatives. Japan, the percentage of the area of Japan that is forested today is 76%. And the forested area of Japan is not decreasing, as in almost every other country of the world. The forested area of Japan is increasing because the Japanese take very good care of their forests. I have to add, they take very good care of their forests because they take very bad care of the forests of other nations.
Tom wants to know about, and this is, I suppose the context of this is a nation that was created during the Enlightenment, when the idea of rationality was a premium, was a plus, was a standard to be aspired to. And Tom's question is how to explain the reaction of so many Americans to COVID, the illogical denial of the reality of the pandemic and the vaccination remedies, so shocking to a country that has prided itself on creating these advances in the first place.
Good question, Tom. Why on earth does the United States, the world leader in science, the country that wins more Nobel Prizes than all the rest of the world together, the world leader in science, why is the United States also among major democracies the world leader in resistance to science? Why do so many Americans deny science? Why is it that the majority, don't laugh at this, this is true, why do the majority of American college biology teachers not believe in biological evolution? Incredible. Why is it? I'm in a collaborative project now with a friend who's in fact coming over to my house the day after tomorrow, and we're trying to understand why is it that the United States, the world leader in science, is also the democratic leader in resistance to science. Is it anything to do with our history? Is it anything to do with the United States being a hyper democracy that we don't want to trust the experts? Is it anything to do with the role of religion in the United States? I don't know. Ask me a year from now and maybe my friend and I will arrive at an answer.
But the impact of it has been devastating on the economy, on the common weal in this country, of the ascendancy of this kind of thinking. It's not just a fringe anymore.
The impact is 750,000 dead Americans who didn't have to be dead. The 750,000 Americans who died of COVID. They didn't have to die of COVID if the government had reacted quickly to COVID. In the government of Vietnam, so Vietnam is not a world leader in science. Nevertheless, when the news reached Vietnam that there was a new disease that had broken out in China, the Vietnamese remembered 2002. They remembered SARS, the emergence of SARS from China. And so Vietnam, within a couple of days of hearing about COVID, closed down with extreme restriction of, in fact, COVID victims in Vietnam were taken out of their houses and put into specialized institutions for taking care of COVID victims. So why Vietnam, not the world leader in science? Why does Vietnam do so much better than the United States at dealing with COVID?
On the same thing, Bob wants to know whether the nation's response to COVID is an example of how rapidly adapting and nimble the society can be when it's pressed, in spite of certain partisan resistance to that. Is there something good, something salutary we can draw out of that?
There's something salutary in regard to some states and some cities and some counties and some Americans taking COVID seriously. I think it's the case that the majority of Americans take COVID seriously. The percentage that don't take COVID seriously is what, estimate maybe 30%. Still, 30% is much too high, and that 30% of Americans who refuse to get vaccinated, that's enough to mess up life for the other 70%.
We talked a little bit about deforestation. Howard wants to know your thoughts about the deforestation of Brazil, and it's been discussed a lot whether Brazil is a global treasure and whether Brazil alone should be answerable and responsible for what happens to its rainforest.
Brazil is a global treasure, but you're not going to get very far in convincing the Brazilian government by telling them, take good care of your global treasure. Brazil is going to act in pursuit of its own interests. Sadly, the destruction of rainforest in Brazil The people who are going to get most clobbered by that are Brazilians. Why? Because Brazil, the Amazon basin, is the world's largest rainforest. If you chop down the rainforest, that changes the climate. The rainforest is a generator of rainfall. And if you chop down the rainforest in Brazil, drought already. Brazil is having problems with drought. Drought is going to get worse and worse for Brazil. And so Brazil's forestry policy, the people who are going to suffer the most from Brazil's forestry policy are Brazilians.
What kind of points do you find in common in all the national crises that you study in the book? Is there a point at which the nation agrees, oh my God, we have a crisis and we have to do something? And is it always later rather than sooner in the stages of the crisis?
Is it all good? Is it always later rather than sooner? Do countries always perceive and react to a crisis too late? No, there are countries that anticipate crises. And I gave you one, Vietnam. It's not that Vietnam anticipated COVID, but Vietnam, as a result of its bad experience with SARS, when Vietnam heard about COVID, Vietnam didn't wait. Vietnam adopted measures immediately. But there's a country that thinks of everything that could go wrong and plans for it. That country is Finland. The Scandinavian country of Finland, because of Finland's experience during World War II, when Finland was cut off from the outside world as a result of the Second World War. Finns could not import fuel, they couldn't import other stuff. Finnish cars during World War II, Finnish cars didn't run on gasoline. Finnish cars, they converted their engines to wood-burning engines. So Finland, after World War II, Finland now has a national government council that meets every month. A Finnish friend of mine is on that council. Every month the council thinks about what could go wrong. And each month they think about a new thing that could go wrong. When I visited my friend in Finland, that he had just come back from that monthly meeting. And that particular monthly meeting was, what will Finland do if the electricity net is broken, is interrupted? Finland has a plan. Naturally, Finland a couple of years ago thought about what would Finland do if there is a new emerging global disease. And Finland, if there's an emerging disease, it might be a respiratory disease. So Finland 3 years ago stockpiled face masks, just as Finland stockpiles fuel and it stockpiles chemicals and it stockpiles everything. And when COVID came along, Finland had its face mask. The United States did not have its face mask. So Finland is the leading country in the world in planning in advance everything that could go wrong. And me, because I work in New Guinea, in the jungles of New Guinea, where if something goes wrong, you got to be prepared for it. I admire Finland because I'm paranoid. I think of everything that could go wrong in my personal life as a result of my experience in New Guinea. And the Finns think of everything that could go wrong in their national life.
I think some people would find that pessimistic, but I find it remarkably encouraging that they're anticipating this. But imagine the PR problems of countries like the United States where it convenes such councils.
Americans might protest, well, the Finns, they're wasting a lot of money stockpiling face masks. They're wasting a lot, they stockpile fuel. It turns out that Finland's stockpiling fuel so that if there's a Gulf oil crisis, they're ready, they got their fuel stockpiles. It adds either 2 cents or 2/10 of a cent. I can't recall which is the correct. It adds either 2 cents or 2/10 of a cent per gallon to the cost of fuel. So it's, and again, stockpiling face masks, that was cheap. But the United States didn't stockpile face masks. And so we had, what, 30,000 or 100,000 dead Americans because we didn't stockpile face masks.
Bob wants to know, this makes me think of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and whether there's a 5th on the horizon. He says, your book lists 4 threats: nuclear war, climate change, limited resources, and extreme inequality. Pandemics should go on that list too?
No, pandemics are not on, they're not on my list of major problems. So Bill Gates, I enjoy discussing with Bill Gates. And I remember my first conversation with Bill Gates, he said, Jared, I know you're concerned about the environment and climate change, but what really worries me is pandemics. My answer was, Bill, I'm not worried about pandemics. Take COVID. The worst case scenario for COVID the death toll from COVID is 2%. Suppose everybody in the world gets infected with COVID, as may well happen. The death toll from COVID is 2% of the world's population. That's what, 174 million people. But climate change can kill every one of us. And depletion of resources can kill every one of us. And a nuclear war can kill every one of us. So compared to the really big problems of climate change, inequality, resource depletion, and nuclear war, no, I'm not worried about pandemics.
Well, that's a hopeful note. Is there anything else you can inject on the same tone into the conversation as we wrap it up?
Yes, to wrap it up, a hopeful note is the upside of COVID is that people are being forced to recognize that COVID is a global problem requiring a global solution. But climate change is a global problem requiring a global solution. And so my hope, my optimistic hope, is that COVID teaches people, because COVID kills you quickly and it kills unequivocally. Climate change kills you slowly and climate change kills indirectly. So my hope is that COVID will teach people that global problems require global solutions, and having mastered COVID in a couple of years, we will generalize and solve the problem of climate change. And that's my hopeful note for the evening.
It's always encouraging to listen to Jared Diamond, who lays out the problems unflinchingly, but then comes up with some answers that leave us with hope and a template for doing the right thing. UCLA is where he works. You can find out more about his work there and maybe even drop in on one of his classes one of these days. Who knows? His latest bestseller is Upheaval: Turning Points for Nations in Crisis. Jared, it's always such a pleasure, a delight to talk to you, and so enlightening. I feel like I deserve college credit every time I do.
Pat, thank you. It's always wonderful conversing with you.
Thank you so much. We want to remind you that next week we will be having former Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer talking here with Madeline Brand about navigating extreme partisanship. You can see more on the screen, find out what's coming up in the weeks to come. Our discussions here, like Carol Lenig, Joanna Mendelson, and Imran Ahmed. I want to thank all the people who made this possible. And of course, a special thanks to you, all of you, for watching and listening to us this evening. Thanks very much. We'll see you next week.